Alex,
Hi, Antonella.
I'm glad to be back for another episode of our research reflections. So, I think I'm particularly excited about this one because I was sharing that it actually came up in a patient visit. And that's really our hope, right, with these things is that, yes, we're going to sort of get into the weeds, but also back out of how this applies clinically, like in the real world, in the recommendations, and how we sort of take this out to be healthy and living well in the world. And so I had a conversation with a patient who had for a very long time really been low carb or no carb or really like tried to avoid them and was finding benefit for them in at breakfast or at lunch, and just including them more in her diet. And she was like, do you think these whole grains are going to be okay? And I was like, you just wait. We're going to have an episode on this. We're going to like get you quickly up to date.
Yeah.
So this really answers that question, sort of like what the role of whole grains are specifically in this case for healthy aging, which I think we could probably, all get behind. So we're going to talk about whole grains and carbohydrates and fiber. So Alex, if you want to orient us to the study we're going to discuss today in our learnings.
Yeah, absolutely. And I completely agree. Like carbohydrate intake is one of the things I feel like we talk a lot about in nutrition, especially in today's day and age where there's, excuse me, a lot of fear
Yeah.
around having carbohydrates, especially as women in midlife. And that's what this is all about.
Mm-hmm.
So the name of the study is Dietary Carbohydrate Intake, Carbohydrate Quality, and Healthy Aging in Women. Excuse me. And it was quite recently published, actually. This one is brand new, last couple of months in 2025, and published by the Journal of the American Medical Association Network Open. So this particular study, it's another observational study, which means that they take a group of people, they take some measurements at the beginning, or they record, investigate those measurements, and then look down the road to see what came of certain things, right? So we call it sort of a exposure and then outcome type of observational data or study. So it's a prospective cohort study. It uses the nurses cohort. And this is actually really relevant right now because this is one of the groups that might be no longer getting any funding, which is a real shame because this group of women has been studied for decades and decades and decades, providing us with lots of amazing information. And this is just an example of that.
Yeah.
So a number of women, so the total number of women who were looked at here is 47,513 women from the Nurses Health Study. When the data was first looked at, where the nutrition data was looked at, was in 1982 to 84. And so, 1984 to 86, when these women were in their late 40s. So what we did is, or what the researchers did, is looked at the nutrition information of these women in their late 40s, way back in 1984, 86. And then they sort of like fast forwarded into 2014, 2016, and took a look at how women were aging. And so they got sort of put into two categories, healthy agers and then sort of like normal agers. And the idea was, can we see a relationship between carbohydrate intake over the course of sort of earlier midlife and link that to any particular health outcomes later on in life, making it more or less likely that someone would experience healthy aging. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. We were really both impressed with what healthy aging was defined as. I don't know if you want to talk about that and then we can move on to the results, because I think it's important to encompass what that healthy aging definition was all about.
Absolutely. So they had a very clear definition, which I think we both agree is one of the positives of this study. So healthy aging was defined as the absence of 11 chronic diseases, and I will list those out, I promise. No physical or memory impairment, as well as having good mental health. And so they use validated questionnaires to assess those things. There was their mental health assessment was more particular to their age group, rather than like a more general PHQ-9 that we might see in other studies assessing mental health. But those chronic conditions that none of the women who were in that healthy aging category had were cancer, type 2 diabetes. They haven't had a myocardial infarction or a heart attack or stroke. They hadn't undergone a bypass or angioplasty, didn't have congestive heart failure, kidney failure, chronic chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, otherwise known as COPD, sometimes also known as emphysema, Parkinson's, MS, or ALS. So very significant chronic diseases were all absent from the healthy aging group. The other thing that we noted was actually that only a very small percentage of that group actually made it into that category. So Alex, you have some numbers for us there, which are actually quite
I
astounding.
Yeah, it was actually fairly shocking and a little bit
Yeah.
discouraging, but also motivating to feel like this is the type of information that we can share, hopefully, among many other things, to help our populations continue to improve their healthy aging, right?
Hmm.
So only at the end of the day, out of that 47 plus thousand women, only 7.8% of them were considered to be healthy agers. That's fairly discouraging,
Yeah.
right? And so again, that means that those women, that 7.8%, were free of those 11 major chronic diseases. They didn't have any impairment to memory or physical function beyond sort of normal aging
Hmm.
pieces. This is anything above and beyond that. And they all reported through validated questionnaires being in good mental health. So a really comprehensive view of healthy aging, and discouragingly a small percent of the population fitting that definition.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, okay, so what were they? So that was the outcome that they were assessing, right? So they're looking at food
Yeah.
frequency questionnaires from that 1984 to 86, and then they're looking at the healthy aging, and they sort of cut and broke down carbohydrates in all different fashions as well as fiber. So talk us through the results there.
Yeah. So they not only wanted to know if sort of having carbohydrates in one's diet was related one way or the other to healthy aging, but also broke it down, like you've just mentioned. So they would look at total carbohydrate intake, but then they would also look at a high quality carbohydrate, a refined carbohydrate bucket, and then also breaking that down into a whole grain bucket, a fruit bucket, a vegetable bucket, a starchy vegetable bucket. And they had a couple of other things that didn't really kind of feed in that much, but those were the big things. So total carbohydrate, high quality carbohydrate, refined carbohydrate, and then sort of individual, almost like food groups within that. And then a separate investigation into like fiber content and what kind of impact fiber would have on this as well. And so quite happily, just jumping into the
Hmm.
results section, quite happily, there is a correlation for the most part between carbohydrate content and those individual buckets and healthy aging. So the way it sort of shook out in a very general overview is that having more total carbohydrate, high quality carbohydrates, whole grains, fruits, vegetables, legumes all increased the odds of being a healthy ager versus a normal ager.
Hmm.
Conversely, having more refined carbohydrates and we'll talk about this more later, or starchy carbohydrates or starchy vegetables specifically, decrease the odds of being a healthy ager compared to a normal ager.
Yeah.
So that's sort of that high level overview. And maybe I'll just touch on a couple of the
Hmm.
numbers that really struck me. So the total carbohydrate intake was a lump of all of the carbohydrates, right? So that included the high quality carbohydrates and the refined carbohydrates all together. But despite that, they saw a 17% increase in the odds ratio, your odds were 17% better of being a healthy ager versus a normal ager. But when we actually broke that down, what became clear was the high quality carbohydrates were carrying the day,
Yeah.
right? So the high quality carbohydrates actually, in and of themselves as a group, led to 31% increased odds of being a healthy ager versus a normal ager. And by contrast, that refined carbohydrate category decreased the odds of being a healthy ager. So you saw 13% lower
Mm.
chance of being a healthy ager versus a normal ager. So even though the total carbohydrate intake is going to lead to healthier aging, is what the conclusion was, really that was coming from the high quality carbohydrates.
Yeah, so really sort of underlining that it's the high quality carbohydrates that are carrying the benefit,
Yeah,
which would be like whole grains, fruits, vegetables, legumes, to define that high
exactly right.
quality grain category
Yeah.
a little bit better.
And then I would say that the last piece, which I had alluded to, the fiber piece.
Mm-hmm.
So even separate from all of those other buckets, if you will, they looked at fiber, and it didn't matter which way they looked at it, whether it was fiber from fruit or total fiber or fiber from vegetables or whole grains. Any which way, increased fiber, increased odds of being a healthy ager, which is great. And one of the things, when we slice and dice, or when we look at how they sliced and diced the data, there's often really interesting little tidbits of information that can come out. And in this particular case, looking at comparing the people who had the least fiber versus the most, the difference might not be as big as you think. So the group that had the lowest intake of fiber, the average or median fiber intake was 11.5 grams. And in the highest quintile, or the group that had the highest fiber intake, it was about double that, so 22.3 grams of fiber. Now, I will also say that even though that doesn't sound like a lot, many of us in North America struggle to get that amount of fiber in, but it is nonetheless a very achievable goal with a little bit of guidance and intention, right? So separate from anything else, high fiber diets are sure for the win.
Totally. Yeah. And that the recommendation in general around fiber actually sits a little bit higher. And this group was a little bit lower, not to say that there would be, optimal here, but those 22 grams were making a difference. And like you said, I think with a little bit of attention, the 22 grams is super achievable. And when we think about it, that's 100% increase from the bottom group, which sounds very significant, but I think very achievable at the same time.
Yeah, definitely. And I would say, before we kind of move towards things that we liked and didn't like and takeaways and so on, it would be inappropriate to skip over what was called a substitution analysis, which is one of our favorite things to talk through. And if you've heard any of our couple of prior sessions so far, we talked about substitution analysis. And that's when in a study they look at, well, what happens if we take this thing and replace something else with that? Is there an improvement, or is there benefit, or is there harm with that replacement? Because if you have more high quality carbohydrates in your diet and you stay at the same caloric level, obviously you're replacing something, right?
Yeah.
So if your calories don't change and you have more of something, you're getting rid of something. And that question can be really pertinent, is the way to put that. So that section of the study was really interesting to us. And do you want to jump in, or do you want me to jump in?
We're going to defer to Alex, because I was actually super confused on this section, but I'll set us up. I can set us up. Let me find the table quickly, because I need a picture. I'm not going to lie. I need a picture.
And to be fair, it wasn't so much Antonella's comprehension. It was the study tricking us. It was they explained it in two completely different ways, which is why studies?
Right, I was going to say, you explained it backwards. It didn't make sense.
Yeah.
But so the first was, what happens if we replace different food groups, so like fat, saturated fat, trans fat, with total carbohydrate? And what did they find? What were the things that were helpful and what were the things that were harmful?
Yeah. So if again, we're keeping all the calories the same, and you're like, okay, I'm convinced I'm going to increase my total carbohydrate intake. And by doing that, I'm going to get rid of, say, protein, right? So I'm going to have more carbs, less protein. And again, carbs being total carbohydrates from all sources.
Yeah.
If you did that, this study suggests that getting rid of the protein is not good. You're not going to see benefits to healthy aging. Remember, that's the goal of this study. So it may be a different answer when we're looking at things like cholesterol levels or cardiovascular health or whatnot. This is all about healthy aging with the definition that they used. In that case, if you increase total carbohydrates and decrease protein intake, you don't see an increased chance of being a healthy ager. In fact, you see a decrease. That's particularly true if you replace your plant proteins with carbohydrate. It's less true, although still true, if you replace your animal proteins with total carbohydrates.
Yes.
The same link was true for polyunsaturated fatty acids. So our famous seed oils and vegetable oils, the replacing those with total carbohydrate content was also a negative relationship. So meaning that you would be less likely to be a healthy ager if you made that swap. So that's where you would replace total
Mhm.
carbohydrates, you would see some harm. You would actually see some benefit if you increase your total carbohydrates and you reduce your fat
Yeah.
intake. So if it was a swap between carbohydrate and fat, you would see an increased chance of being a healthy ager, and in particular with trans fats, which we don't worry about anymore because in our North American food supply, we don't see trans fats anymore. But back in the day when they got this original data, the trans fats were a very real thing.
Yeah.
And if anything, this just highlights how bad trans fats are. But even just total fat, replacing that with more total carbohydrates, you're going to see benefit. So that's the total carbohydrate piece.
Yeah. So then our second piece was what happens if we sub in high quality carbohydrates. And that data sort of
Yeah.
panned out differently in that
Yeah.
it really actually favored the whole grains in a lot more categories. So which ones were favored in that regard?
Yeah. So if, again, calories are the same. So
Mhm.
if you add more of something, you have to get rid of something, right? So calories are the same. We add more of the high quality carbohydrates. So that's not just the whole grains,
Yes.
but also the fruits, veg, and legumes. So if we add more of those and we get rid of refined carbohydrate equivalently,
Mhm.
definitely a benefit. And I don't think that's hard for anyone to imagine. I'm adding more chickpeas and getting rid of candy.
Yeah. And pizza.
I have a higher, that's right. Like I have a higher chance of being a healthy ager over time,
Mhm.
right? There's also benefit in using or adding more high quality carbs and getting rid of total fat. So that still remained the case. And the protein story started to change here. So we actually see a bit of benefit adding more high quality carbohydrates and reducing animal protein. It was barely there, but it was there. And that wasn't the case with the plant protein. So it was just neutral. If you replace high quality carbohydrates for plant protein, you're no further ahead, but you're not behind either, is the way that sort of sorted out. There was no harm with any of the substitutions, right? So if you added the high quality carb, that you would either be neutral, like there wouldn't be any extra benefit, or you would win.
Yeah.
There wasn't any situation where adding the high quality carbohydrates led to worse outcomes, or put another way, led to you being more likely to be a normal ager rather than a healthy ager.
Yeah.
So the high quality carbs, again, really stand out here as the big part of the total carbohydrates that make the difference. And it's at worst, no difference, and at best leads to a much better chance of being a healthy ager.
Yeah, and I think also a good point you made on that first model was that protein is important for healthy aging, right? That when we're seeing
Mhm.
those swaps, there's something happening there that like at the cost of protein, we don't always get benefit. That
Yeah.
picture, gets a little bit more nuanced when it's a high quality. I keep wanting to say whole grain. So thank you for catching
Yeah.
me. High quality carbohydrate
Yeah.
that gets a little bit tighter and more nuanced, but overall, I think we're also seeing that importance of protein and healthy aging and then high quality carbohydrates moving
Yeah.
forward.
Yeah. And I mean, what we don't get to hear or what we don't get to know in these types of things is nuances like a high quality carbohydrate as a package, right? Maybe
Yeah.
not so much the fruits, but if we package together fruits, vegetables, legumes, and whole grains, that package is going to have more protein in it, plant
Mhm.
protein in it, than your refined carbohydrates, right? So one of the reasons why we might not see that as strongly when we're replacing the high quality carbohydrates for the protein as we do for total carbohydrates and proteins is that we are actually seeing a slightly increased protein content coming from those higher quality carbohydrates, right?
Yeah.
So that's possible. I don't know that that's true, and there's no means to determine that,
Mhm.
but this is the fun of kind of talking these through and trying to figure out why these things happen.
Yeah. So another thing that we talked through was this starchy vegetable category,
Yes.
because it included potatoes, corn, and yams. And so from my perspective, like I first commented on this in our internal discussion, and I was like, well, corn and yams are, probably the base of lots of diets. If I think of the Americas, right? Like, or, Central and South America and potatoes, yams probably on the continent of Africa, right? Like, as just these like staple starchy foods. And so now we've got this category here that's like starchy foods, not good. But that's where we wanted to dig in. And so this category that had potatoes, corn and yams. There was something specific about the potatoes that it included, if you want to highlight that for us, Alex.
Right. So the potatoes were things like French fries and potato chips and
Mashed
not
potatoes.
what we would mashed potatoes, right? So it's, which is a way that many of us, especially in North America, have our potatoes for the most part. So on the one hand, that applies to this population and to many populations that we're talking to. But is it really the potato's fault? Right?
Yeah.
So to suggest that maybe the potato and the corn and the yam, but particularly the potato, is inherently a problem, I don't think is exactly the takeaway we can have here. I mean, we could say that if you eat those foods, especially the potato category, as almost exclusively mashed potato, French fries, and potato chips, then, in compared to virtually all other carbohydrates, other than refined carbohydrates, you're not setting yourself up for success.
Yeah.
But that's not necessarily, again, potato's fault.
Totally. And then, like, for example, the corn was actually included in the vegetable category. So it's actually
As well. Yeah.
living in other categories, which makes me less suspicious that the corn is going to be an issue unless it's as a corn dog, for example, right? Like, do corn dogs,
or corn chip.
right? Like corn chip. Yeah. Like, I guess corn
Yeah.
dogs do have corn in them. But right, like if we think of their traditional uses, it's probably like not being represented in this category. Of like boiled or roasted potatoes, or the way it would be used in a more
Baked.
baked, not deep fried over and over, or not with a lot of saturated fat added to it. I mean, albeit those things are delicious, we're not gonna lie.
Yes.
But still, that's like not a good representation of what a potato could be on a on the day in and day out situations.
Exactly. It's not being its best self. Exactly. Yeah.
Or
and I
is
will also
it like a French fry
right,
is a potato's best self, but it can't be like that every day.
Yes, that's right. Good point. I will also point out that when we look at these numbers, like you can't take them all not that you can't take them at face value, but you also have to look at something that's called a confidence interval. So in the statistics of a study, they can say, okay, well, there was a 50% decrease, but then they give you this confidence interval saying like, well, yes, what we really think it is 50%, but it could be as low as this or as high as this. And in studies, we want to see that confidence interval really close to the number that we're guessing, right? So in the 50% example, we would want to see it, ideally it would be like, we think it's 50%. It could be as low as 49 or as high as 51, right? That would be like so perfect. And you would feel really confident that even if it were 49 or 51, that the conclusion is the same, right? Yeah. And in this particular case, the confidence interval was wide enough and butted up to a number that was almost not significant. So not only do we have these questions around the quality of the potatoes being ingested as part of that category, but we're also less confident that the concern is warranted based on the statistical analysis.
Yeah.
But it was significant. It was just on the edge. So we have to say it was significant. It was just that one, I think we raised more of an eyebrow at than the other.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say, like, I think that category, when it's cooked in a maybe like fried or super high caloric way, right? Those are categories that have like color and prebiotics. Like there's other aspects of it that I think we're pulling from other areas to sort of, it raised our eyebrows a little bit. That for me, as we transition into sort of how does this apply clinically, does it change how we give recommendations? I wouldn't be quick to say we need to get starchy vegetables out of people's diets. I still think they can have a role. I don't think they're represented in how they're used healthfully out in the world. And then I think this gives a really strong case in favor of whole grains and fiber, right? Like that.
And fruits and vegetables and legumes.
Yeah, totally. Thank you. Thank you. But again, maybe that's a good point, right? That like we're so quick to take out food groups that, I even work with women who like feel like they can't have fruit, for example. But here we're seeing a very like well-rounded, balanced, diverse, I think we're going to probably touch on this idea of diversity quite a bit as we have these discussions that, saw that benefit to healthy aging. And that definition is like not shy, right? Like that definition is like, we don't want you to have any of these big things. So I think that's compelling, and it doesn't really change a lot from my perspective. What about you?
Yeah, agreed. And I would say when we were talking about the takeaways for clinical practice, one of my concerns was, someone might look at this study or read the headlines and say, well, they said starchy carbohydrates were no, or starchy vegetables were no good. And I think we've addressed why we think that that isn't the whole story. And also alluding to the fact that that category was just corn, potatoes, and yams, didn't include what a lot of people consider as starchy vegetables like peas and
Mhm.
carrots and beets and things that people avoid on the regular if they're eating low carb. And this was not that. And it already had some other, like I said, concerns that we've highlighted in terms of its strength of association. But yes, I also often really encouraging people not to cut out whole food groups. And in today's day and age, a lot of that conversation is around kind of the low carb or
Yeah.
lower carb conversation. And that's a larger conversation for other scenarios. But as it relates to healthy aging, and in particular with this really, like you said, robust definition of healthy aging, like this is really encouraging that these things often make people feel happier because
Mhm.
of the breadth of foods that they can enjoy, and to know that this can help promote healthy aging in a really strict way, like that was such a great definition, is really encouraging. The takeaway around how protein may be important there
Mhm.
as well, I think was a great takeaway. And so we talk about protein a lot too, and it just kind of keeps that conversation going. But yeah, at the end of the day, it keeps it really simple and didn't contradict things that I think we focus on already, which is healthy or not healthy, but those complex carbohydrates,
Mhm.
right? The fruits, vegetables, legumes, and whole grains, high fiber,
Yes.
and that can be really achievable, like we just said, with some coaching and some intention, if that's not something that's achievable right now. And then protein, particularly plant protein, being important as well.
Mhm. Yeah. All right. So I think that closes off our thoughts on this guy, and we'll look
Mhm.
forward to seeing you all the next time.
Yes, indeed. Thanks, Antonella.
Thanks, Alex.